What happens when love becomes the deadliest weapon on a plantation? When a woman's suffering ignites a fire that no overseer can extinguish? In 1847, on Whitmore Plantation in South Carolina, Ruth endured daily horrors at the hands of Master James. But she wasn't alone. Her partner Thomas had been watching, planning, waiting. What he did didn't just save Ruth, it changed the entire plantation forever. This is the story of how love transformed two broken souls into an unstoppable force. The screaming stopped at exactly midnight, but Thomas knew Ruth was still awake in the master's house. He pressed his face against the cold cabin wall, counting the seconds until she would return, if she returned at all. Master James had been keeping her later each night, and Thomas could see the light flickering in the upstairs window where unspeakable things happened behind closed doors. His hands clenched into fists that had learned to stay still, but tonight felt different. Tonight, something inside him was breaking free. Ruth appeared in the doorway like a ghost, her dress torn at the shoulder, her eyes hollow with the kind of pain that words couldn't touch. She moved slowly, carefully, as if her body belonged to someone else. Thomas reached for her, but she flinched away, a reflex that cut deeper than any whip. They had been together for 3 years, planning to jump the broom next spring, but Master James had other plans. He had chosen Ruth as his new plaything 6 months ago, and since then, their world had become a living nightmare. "He's getting worse," Ruth whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hands shook as she tried to fix her dress, but the fabric kept falling away, revealing bruises that painted a map of violence across her skin. Thomas wanted to rage, to burn down the entire plantation, but Ruth needed him calm. She needed him to be her anchor in a storm that threatened to drown them both. "He said something tonight, Thomas, something about selling you." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the chest. He had suspected this was coming. Master James was jealous of their love, threatened by the way Ruth looked at Thomas with tenderness she could never fake for her abuser. Selling Thomas would break Ruth completely, and that's exactly what James wanted. A broken woman was easier to control, easier to possess. Thomas pulled Ruth close, feeling her trembling against his chest, and made a decision that would change everything. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "Tomorrow night when the moon is dark. I won't let him touch you again." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas knew running wasn't enough. They had tried once before and been caught by the patrollers. The beating that followed nearly killed them both, and James had made it clear there wouldn't be a second chance. No, running wouldn't save them. Only one thing would end this nightmare permanently, and Thomas had been preparing for it longer than Ruth knew. Ruth looked up at him with eyes that held both love and terror. "He'll kill us if we try again. You know what happened to Samuel and Mary." Everyone knew their story. The couple had been caught 3 miles from the plantation, brought back in chains, and made examples of in front of every slave. Samuel was sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a death sentence disguised as commerce. Mary was given to the overseer as payment for his tracking services. They never saw each other again. But Thomas had learned from Samuel's mistakes. Samuel had run without a plan, without preparation, without understanding that freedom couldn't be taken by force alone. It had to be earned through patience, cunning, and sacrifice. Thomas had been watching Master James for months, studying his habits, his weaknesses, his fears. He knew about the gambling debts that kept James awake at night. He knew about the laudanum addiction that made the master's hands shake. He knew about the secret letters hidden in the study, letters that could destroy James's reputation if they ever saw daylight. "Thomas," Ruth said, her voice stronger now, "what are you planning?" She knew him too well, could see the calculation behind his eyes. Thomas had always been different from the other slaves. He could read and write, skills his previous master had taught him before selling him to pay debts. He understood the white man's world in ways that made him dangerous, and Ruth could sense that danger building like a storm. "I'm planning to make him disappear," Thomas said quietly. "Not kill him, that would bring too much attention, but make him want to disappear, make him run so far from this place that he never comes back." Ruth's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and fear. She had seen Thomas outsmart overseers before, had watched him turn their own prejudices against them, but this was different. This was Master James, a man with connections, power, and absolutely nothing to lose. "The letters," Thomas continued, "the ones he keeps locked in his desk. I know what's in them, Ruth. I've been watching him read them, seeing how his face goes white when he opens that drawer. He's been selling slaves that don't exist, taking money from buyers in Charleston for people he never owned. It's fraud on a scale that could put him in prison, maybe even get him hanged." Ruth felt her heart racing. "How do you know all this?" Thomas smiled grimly. "Because I've been cleaning his study for 3 months. He thinks I can't read, thinks I'm just another ignorant field hand. But I see everything, Ruth. I see how he forges documents, how he creates fake bills of sale, how he's been stealing from his own neighbors. Master James isn't just evil, he's stupid. And stupid men make mistakes." The plan was dangerous beyond words, but it was also brilliant. Thomas would steal the letters, copy them, and use them as leverage. James would have 2 choices: let them go free or face exposure and ruin. But Ruth knew there was more to it. She could see the cold calculation in Thomas's eyes, the way he spoke about James like a problem to be solved rather than a man to be feared. "There's something else," Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I know why he chose you, Ruth. It's not just because you're beautiful. It's because he knows I love you and he wants to break that love. He thinks if he can take you from me completely, he'll prove that we're nothing more than animals. But he's wrong, and I'm going to show him just how wrong he is." Ruth felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope, of relief, of love so powerful it could move mountains. Thomas wasn't just planning their escape. He was planning their revenge, their vindication, their proof that love could conquer even the cruelest master. But as they held each other in the darkness of their cabin, neither of them realized that Master James was planning something too, something that would test their love in ways they couldn't imagine. Because James had been watching them as carefully as Thomas had been watching him. He had seen the way Thomas looked at him during morning inspections, had noticed the way Ruth's defiance was growing stronger instead of weaker. James wasn't just cruel, he was cunning, and he had learned that the best way to break a strong slave was to make them believe they had power, then crush that belief completely. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new tests, new chances for everything to go wrong. But tonight, in the darkness of their cabin, Thomas and Ruth held each other and planned for freedom. They didn't know that their love was about to become the most dangerous weapon on Whitmore Plantation, or that the price of their freedom would be higher than either of them could imagine. Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the harsh bell that summoned every slave to another day of torment. Thomas moved through his morning routine like a man possessed, his mind calculating every detail of the plan that would either free them or destroy them completely. He had spent the night memorizing the layout of Master James's study, counting the steps from the door to the desk, timing how long it took to pick the lock on the drawer that held those damning letters. Everything had to be perfect, because they would only get one chance. Ruth worked in the big house kitchen, her hands steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. She could feel Master James watching her from the doorway, his eyes hungry and cruel, already planning what he would do to her that evening. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just a victim waiting for rescue. She was part of the plan, and that knowledge gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. When James approached her with that familiar predatory smile, she didn't shrink away. Instead, she met his gaze with something that made him pause. "You're looking mighty confident today, Ruth," James said, his voice carrying the lazy menace that had terrorized her for months. "I hope you're not getting any foolish ideas about that boy of yours." Ruth continued kneading bread dough, her movements deliberate and calm. "No, sir, Master James, no foolish ideas at all." But her tone carried something new, something that sounded almost like pity, and James felt a flicker of unease that he couldn't quite explain. What James didn't know was that Thomas had already begun the first phase of their plan. While cleaning the study that morning, he had carefully photographed every detail with his mind, noting which floorboards creaked, which curtains blocked the view from outside, which books on the shelf could be moved to create hiding places. More importantly, he had discovered something that changed everything. Master James wasn't just stealing from buyers in Charleston. He was also embezzling money from his own family, skimming profits from the plantation, and hiding them in accounts under false names. The letters Thomas had glimpsed weren't just evidence of fraud. They were correspondence with abolitionists in the North, men who were paying James to help slaves escape. But James wasn't helping anyone escape. He was taking their money and pocketing it, while the slaves who were supposed to be freed remained in bondage. It was a betrayal so profound, so utterly without conscience, that even other slaveholders would be horrified. Thomas realized he wasn't just holding evidence of crime. He was holding proof of the kind of evil that could destroy a man's entire world. But as Thomas planned their liberation, Master James was orchestrating a trap that would test their love in the cruelest way possible. He had received word that morning from a slave trader in Savannah, a man known for buying rebellious slaves and working them to death in the rice fields. The trader was coming to Whitmore Plantation that very afternoon, and James had already decided which slave he would sell. Thomas would be gone by evening, shipped away before he could implement whatever scheme was brewing behind those intelligent eyes. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. James would announce the sale publicly, in front of all the slaves, making it clear that Ruth's behavior had sealed Thomas's fate. If she had been more compliant, more broken, Thomas would have been safe. But her growing defiance had convinced James that their love was a threat that needed to be eliminated permanently. He would break Ruth by making her watch the man she loved disappear forever, and she would have no choice but to accept her fate as his property. Ruth sensed something was wrong the moment James entered the kitchen with that particular smile, the one that meant he had devised some new torment. "I have wonderful news, Ruth," he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "Your Thomas is going to take a little trip. There's a gentleman coming today who's very interested in purchasing a strong field hand, and I think Thomas would be perfect for his operation down in Savannah." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly what Thomas had predicted might happen. James was trying to separate them before they could execute their plan, but they had prepared for this possibility. "That's your decision to make, Master James," she said quietly, though her heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own voice. James studied her face, looking for the breakdown he expected, the tears and pleading that would feed his sadistic hunger. When he saw only quiet acceptance, his smile faltered. "You don't seem upset, Ruth. Don't you care what happens to that boy?" Ruth met his eyes with a steadiness that unnerved him. "Caring don't change nothing, Master James. You do what you want to do. You always have." The response wasn't what James had expected, and for the first time in months he felt like he was losing control of the situation. Ruth was supposed to be broken by now, reduced to a sobbing, desperate woman who would do anything to save her man. Instead, she seemed almost serene, as if she knew something he didn't. James felt a chill of uncertainty, but he pushed it aside. Thomas would be gone by nightfall, and then Ruth would learn the price of defiance. What James didn't know was that Thomas had been expecting this move. He had seen the signs in James's behavior, the way the master had been watching him more carefully, the subtle questions about his work in the fields. Thomas knew that any plan to expose James would have to happen quickly, before he could be sold and separated from Ruth forever. But he also knew that James's impatience would be his downfall. The slave trader arrived just after noon, a thin, cruel-faced man named Briggs who looked at human beings the way other men looked at livestock. Thomas watched from the fields as Briggs examined him like a horse, checking his teeth, feeling the muscles in his arms, discussing his price as if he wasn't standing right there. But Thomas wasn't afraid. He was calculating, using every moment to refine his plan and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. "This one's got some education," James was explaining to Briggs. "Knows his letters, which makes him useful but dangerous. That's why I'm selling him. Too smart for his own good, if you know what I mean." Briggs nodded knowingly. He specialized in breaking smart slaves, turning their intelligence against them until they wished they had never learned to think. "I'll take him," Briggs said. "My usual price for the educated ones. They're worth the extra cost once you teach them their place." The sale was set for sunset, but Thomas had no intention of being anyone's property when darkness fell. As the afternoon wore on, he moved through his work with mechanical precision, waiting for the moment when James would return to his study to finalize the paperwork. Ruth had managed to slip him a message during the midday meal, just 2 words written on a scrap of cloth. "Tonight. Ready." Everything depended on timing now. Thomas had to get into that study, photograph those letters, and get the evidence to safety before Briggs could take him away. But more than that, he had to do it in a way that would destroy James so completely that the man would never again have the power to hurt another human being. The plan was dangerous beyond words, but it was also their only chance for justice. As the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Thomas made his way toward the big house. He could see Ruth in the kitchen window, her face calm but her eyes blazing with determination. Master James was in his study, probably counting the money Briggs had paid for his newest victim. But James had no idea that his victim was about to become his judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one. The game was about to begin, and Thomas intended to win. But as he approached the house where so much suffering had taken place, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something bigger than just their escape. He was walking into a confrontation that would define not just their future, but the future of every slave who had ever dared to dream of freedom. The study door opened with barely a whisper, testament to Thomas's weeks of careful observation. Master James sat hunched over his desk, quills scratching across papers that would seal Thomas's fate, completely unaware that his victim had become his hunter. The lamplight cast dancing shadows across the room, and Thomas moved between them like smoke, his bare feet silent on the Persian rug that had been bought with the blood of his people. Every step brought him closer to the desk, closer to the evidence that would either destroy James or destroy them all. James looked up just as Thomas's hand closed around the brass letter opener on the desk. For a heartbeat, master and slave stared at each other across a chasm of power that had seemed absolute just moments before. James's mouth opened to scream for help, but Thomas was already moving, pressing the sharp point against the soft flesh of James's throat with just enough pressure to draw a single drop of blood. "Don't," Thomas whispered, his voice calm despite the fury burning in his eyes. "Don't make a sound, don't move, don't even breathe too loud, because if you do, I'll open your throat right here in your fancy study, and Ruth will finally be free of you." James's face went white as he realized that the quiet, obedient slave he thought he knew had never existed. The man holding a blade to his throat was someone else entirely, someone dangerous beyond his worst nightmares. "You can't do this," James stammered, his voice barely audible. "They'll hang you. They'll burn this whole plantation down looking for you." Thomas smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any rage could have been. "Maybe they will, but you won't be alive to see it." He pressed the letter opener a fraction deeper, and James whimpered like a child. "Now you're going to open that drawer, the locked one, and you're going to show me every letter, every document, every piece of evidence that proves what you really are." James's hand shook so violently he could barely work the key, but fear gave him focus. The drawer slid open to reveal exactly what Thomas had hoped to find: dozens of letters, forged documents, and account books that detailed years of fraud, embezzlement, and betrayal. But among the papers was something Thomas hadn't expected, something that made his blood run cold with a rage so pure it threatened to consume him entirely. There were receipts, bills of sale for slaves who had never been sold, people who had simply disappeared from the plantation over the years. Men, women, children who James had reported as runaways or dead, but who had actually been murdered and buried in unmarked graves to cover up his crimes. Thomas's hands trembled as he read name after name, recognizing people he had known, people he had loved, people whose deaths had been covered up to protect James's reputation. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "You didn't just steal money, you killed them. You killed Sarah when she threatened to tell about the books. You killed old Moses when he saw you with those letters. You killed—" His voice caught as he read the last name on the list. "You killed my brother Samuel. He didn't run away. You murdered him." James saw the change in Thomas's face and knew he was about to die. "Please," he begged, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I can make this right. I can give you money, freedom papers, anything you want. Just don't kill me." But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at the evidence of his brother's murder, remembering how Samuel had questioned some of James's business dealings, how he had asked too many questions about missing slaves. Samuel hadn't run away to freedom. He had been silenced forever. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke through Thomas's rage. Ruth appeared in the doorway, her eyes taking in the scene with remarkable calm. She had known this moment would come, had prepared herself for whatever she might find. But seeing Thomas holding a blade to their tormentor's throat filled her with a fierce joy that surprised her with its intensity. "Is it time?" she asked quietly, and Thomas nodded. Ruth moved to the desk and began gathering the papers, her movements quick and efficient. They had planned for this moment, discussed what they would need to ensure their freedom, but the discovery of James's murders had changed everything. This wasn't just about escape anymore. This was about justice for every soul that James had destroyed. "We can't just take the papers and run," Thomas said, his voice hard as steel. "Too many people are dead because of him. Too many families destroyed. If we let him live, he'll just find a way to continue." Ruth met his eyes and saw the pain there, the grief for his brother mixing with years of accumulated rage. She understood what he was asking, what choice lay before them. "The traitor," Ruth said suddenly. "Briggs, he's waiting in the barn for you to be brought to him. What if Master James never makes it to that meeting?" Thomas looked at her with new understanding. Briggs was expecting to take delivery of his purchase. If James simply disappeared, if his body was never found, it would look like he had run away with the money from the sale. No one would think to look for a dead man. James followed their conversation with growing horror. "You can't just murder me," he whispered. "I'm a white man. They'll tear this county apart looking for my killer." Ruth laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Looking for your killer, Master James, who's going to tell them you're missing. That traitor thinks you ran off with his money. Your neighbors think you're a successful planter. The slaves will say you went for a ride and never came back. By the time anyone gets suspicious, we'll be long gone." The plan crystallized with terrible clarity. James would disappear completely, his body buried somewhere it would never be found. The evidence of his crimes would be sent to authorities in Charleston, men who would be horrified to discover the extent of his corruption, but relieved that the problem had solved itself. Thomas and Ruth would escape in the confusion, carrying freedom papers that James would write before he died. "Write," Thomas commanded, pressing the letter opener deeper into James's throat. "Write that Ruth and Thomas are free, that you're releasing us from bondage as payment for faithful service. Make it legal, make it binding, make it something that will stand up in any court." James's hand shook as he took up the quill, but he wrote exactly what Thomas dictated. Each word was a nail in his own coffin, but also a key to their freedom. As James finished the papers, Ruth moved behind him with something she had taken from the kitchen. A length of rope, thin but strong, the kind used to tie up meat before roasting. James saw it in the mirror above his desk and began to sob. "Please," he whispered one last time. "I have money hidden, gold, I can make you rich." Thomas met his eyes in the mirror. "You can't buy back the lives you took. You can't purchase forgiveness for what you did to Ruth. And you sure as hell can't pay enough to bring my brother back." The rope tightened around James's throat with surprising gentleness. Ruth had learned many things in the big house, including how to end a life without violence, without rage, with the same calm efficiency she had once used to prepare his meals. James struggled briefly, his hands clawing at the rope, but Thomas held him still while Ruth finished what they had started together. When it was over, they sat in the lamplight for a long moment, holding each other while James's body cooled in the chair behind them. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, but they felt no guilt, only relief. The monster that had terrorized them for so long was finally dead, and they were finally free. They worked quickly after that, wrapping James's body in the Persian rug and carrying it to a place Thomas had prepared weeks ago. A deep pit in the woods, far from any path, where the earth would swallow their secret and keep it forever. By dawn, there would be nothing left to show that Master James had ever existed except the papers that proved his crimes and the freedom documents that proved their right to walk away. As the sun rose over Whitmore Plantation, Thomas and Ruth walked hand in hand down the dusty road that led away from their past and toward their future. Behind them, chaos was beginning as the overseer discovered that both the master and 2 slaves had vanished in the night. But Thomas and Ruth were already miles away, carrying their freedom papers and enough of James's hidden gold to start a new life somewhere far from the horrors they had endured. Years later, they would tell their children about the plantation where they had been enslaved, about the evil man who had tried to break their love, and about the night when justice finally came calling. They would speak of it not as a tale of revenge, but as a story of love triumphant, of 2 people who refused to be broken no matter how much pain they endured. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was right, they would remember Master James not with hatred, but with pity for a man who had possessed everything and thrown it all away for the sake of cruelty. He had tried to destroy their love and had instead made it stronger than steel, more precious than gold, more enduring than the memory of his crimes. Their love had indeed become the deadliest weapon on Whitmore Plantation, but it had also become their salvation, their strength, and their legacy to generations yet to be born. 10 years had passed since that night at Whitmore Plantation, but the shadows of the past refused to stay buried. Thomas and Ruth had built a new life in Philadelphia, where they ran a small boarding house that secretly served as a station on the Underground Railroad. They had changed their names to Samuel and Grace Freeman, honoring Thomas's murdered brother while claiming the freedom they had fought so hard to win. Their love had grown stronger through the years, blessed with 2 children who knew nothing of the violence that had secured their liberty. But on a cold February morning in 1857, their carefully constructed peace shattered when a familiar face appeared at their door. Marcus Briggs, the slave trader who had come to buy Thomas all those years ago, stood on their porch with a knowing smile that made Ruth's blood turn to ice. He was older now, grayer, but his eyes held the same cruel intelligence that had once evaluated human beings like livestock. "Well, well," Briggs said, his voice carrying the lazy menace they remembered too well. "Samuel and Grace Freeman, is it? Funny how much you both look like some slaves who disappeared from South Carolina about 10 years back. Slaves named Thomas and Ruth, if I recall correctly." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Ruth, but his heart was pounding. They had been so careful, had covered their tracks so thoroughly, but somehow their past had found them anyway. Briggs pushed past them into the boarding house, his eyes taking in the comfortable furnishings, the books on the shelves, the photographs of their children on the mantelpiece. "You've done well for yourselves," he said, settling into Thomas's favorite chair as if he owned the place. "Built quite the life on blood money, haven't you? Because that's what this is, isn't it? The proceeds from murdering Master James Whitmore." Ruth felt the world tilting around her. They had been so certain that James's disappearance had been accepted as an abandonment, that no one had connected his vanishing to their escape. But Briggs was here, in their home, threatening everything they had built together. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice shook with the effort of maintaining the lie. "Oh, I think you do," Briggs replied, pulling out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "See, I never forgot about that night. Lost a lot of money when James disappeared with my payment, and I'm the kind of man who holds grudges. So I kept asking questions, kept digging, kept following leads that everyone else ignored. And you know what I found?" Thomas's hands clenched into fists as Briggs unfolded the newspaper. The headline made his stomach drop. Whitmore plantation owner's remains discovered. Below it was a sketch that looked disturbingly like James's face, reconstructed from a skull that hunters had found in the woods just 6 months ago. Animals had scattered the bones over the years, but enough remained to identify the cause of death as strangulation. Funny thing about bones, Briggs continued conversationally. They don't lie the way people do. That rope was still around his neck vertebrae, can you imagine? And when they searched his study more carefully, they found some very interesting scratches on his desk. Scratches that spelled out 2 names, Thomas and Ruth, carved right into the wood like someone wanted to leave a message. Ruth's mind raced back to that night, trying to remember if Thomas had indeed carved their names into James's desk. She couldn't recall, but the years had blurred many details of that violent evening. What mattered now was that their secret was out, and Briggs held their lives in his hands like a loaded weapon. "What do you want?" Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. Briggs smiled, and the expression was worse than any threat could have been. "Justice," he said simply. "See, I've become something of a bounty hunter in my old age. The Fugitive Slave Act has made it very profitable to return runaway property to their rightful owners. And murderers, well, murderers are worth even more." The children's laughter drifted down from upstairs, innocent and joyful, completely unaware that their world was about to collapse. Ruth thought of 8-year-old Hope and 6-year-old Freedom, names they had chosen to honor their journey from bondage to liberty. Those children had never known hunger, never felt the lash, never watched their parents suffer daily humiliation. They were everything Thomas and Ruth had dreamed of during those dark nights in the slave quarters. "My children are free," Ruth said firmly, "born free in a free state. Whatever you think we did, they have nothing to do with it." Briggs chuckled, a sound like breaking glass. "Free? Oh, my dear woman, you're still thinking like a slave. Those children are the offspring of murderers and fugitives. Under the law, they're as much property as their parents ever were." Thomas felt something break inside him, the same cold fury that had driven him to James's study all those years ago. He had killed once to protect Ruth, and he would kill again to protect his children. But Briggs seemed to read his thoughts, because he held up a warning hand and smiled even wider. "Before you get any ideas about repeating your past performance," Briggs said, "you should know that I didn't come alone. There are federal marshals stationed around this house, all of them armed, all of them with orders to shoot if I don't walk out that door in exactly 1 hour. And if something happens to me, well, let's just say they have very detailed instructions about what to do with fugitive murderers and their spawn." The trap was perfect, more elegant than anything James had ever devised. Briggs had learned from the past, had prepared for every contingency, had made himself untouchable while holding their entire family hostage. Thomas and Ruth could see their options narrowing with each passing second, each breath bringing them closer to a choice between surrender and suicide. But as they stood there, facing the destruction of everything they had built, something unexpected happened. Hope came running down the stairs, her face bright with excitement about some game she had been playing with her brother. She stopped when she saw the stranger in their parlor, her young mind immediately sensing that something was wrong. "Mama," she said, moving closer to Ruth. "Who is this man?" Briggs looked at the child with the same expression he had once used to evaluate slaves, and Ruth saw something flicker across his face. Not kindness, but something else. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. For just a moment the cruel mask slipped, and Ruth saw something almost human in his eyes. "This is Mr. Briggs," Ruth said carefully. "He's just visiting." Hope studied the stranger with the fearless curiosity of childhood, then walked directly up to him and extended her small hand. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Briggs. Are you staying for dinner? Mama makes the best cornbread in Philadelphia." The simple gesture seemed to hit Briggs like a physical blow. He stared at the child's outstretched hand for a long moment, and when he looked up, his eyes were filled with something that might have been pain. "I had a daughter once," he said quietly. "About your age. Yellow fever took her." Ruth felt her heart stop. This was the opening she had prayed for, the crack in Briggs's armor that might save them all. "What was her name?" she asked gently. Briggs was quiet for so long that they thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Hope. Her name was Hope." The coincidence hit everyone in the room like lightning. Hope Freeman looked up at the man who had come to destroy her family, and her young face filled with the kind of compassion that only children possess. "That's my name too," she said simply. "Maybe that means we're connected somehow. Papa says names have power." Briggs looked at Thomas with new eyes, seeing not just a fugitive slave but a father who had given his daughter the same name that still haunted his dreams. The bounty hunter who had tracked them across 10 years and 1,000 miles suddenly seemed smaller, older, more human than monster. Ruth could see him wavering, could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. "She would have been about your age now," Briggs said to Hope, his voice thick with emotion. "Would have had your same bright eyes, your same fearless spirit." He looked up at Thomas and Ruth, and for the first time since he had entered their home, his expression held no malice. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me what really happened that night. Not the official story, not the legal version. Tell me the truth." And so they did. In front of their daughter, in front of the man who held their fate in his hands, Thomas and Ruth told the truth about Master James Whitmore. They spoke of the daily horrors, the murders, the fraud, the systematic destruction of human souls that had been James's legacy. They told him about Samuel's death, about the missing slaves, about the choice they had faced between justice and mercy. When they finished, Briggs sat in silence for a long time. Hope had climbed onto his lap during the story, her small hand resting trustingly on his arm. "He sounds like a very bad man," she said. "I'm glad you stopped him from hurting more people." Out of the mouths of babes came the absolution that no court could ever provide. Briggs stood slowly, gently setting Hope on her feet. He walked to the window and stared out at the street where federal marshals waited for his signal. Thomas and Ruth held their breath, knowing that their lives hung on whatever decision this broken man would make in the next few moments. "You know," Briggs said finally, "I've been chasing ghosts for 10 years, chasing revenge for money I lost, justice for crimes I never really cared about. But standing here, looking at what you've built, seeing what love can create instead of what hate can destroy." He turned back to them with tears in his eyes. "My Hope would have wanted me to choose mercy." He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Marcus Briggs died on his way to Philadelphia," he said. "Heart attack, very sudden. The marshals outside will never find the fugitives they're looking for because those people stopped existing the moment they chose love over hate." He looked back at Hope one last time. "Take care of that name, little one. Make it mean something beautiful." And then he was gone, leaving behind a family that had been saved not by violence or cunning, but by the simple power of a child's compassion and a broken man's capacity for redemption. Thomas and Ruth held each other and their children, understanding finally that their story wasn't just about escape or revenge. It was about the triumph of love over hate, hope over despair, and the possibility that even the darkest hearts could find their way to the light. The past would always be part of them, but it no longer defined them. They were free, truly free, to write their own ending to a story that had begun in chains but would finish in love.